So, is it too late to talk about the World Championship? It's been like a month since the season ended, so it feels like it's kinda too late. But at the same time, I can't really move on until I've talked about it at least a little bit. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna pick out some teams to talk about like I did for the Winter and Spring Majors, and if it applies, I'm gonna give some brief thoughts about some moves that they made in the offseason so far. That seems like a pretty good compromise to me. So yeah, with that, let's get into it. I think it's only right that we start this video by following up on the topic of my last one and checking in on NRG. I spent a lot of time in that video talking about their defense and focusing on how is their team's greatest strength, but had fallen off in recent events for a few different reasons. But at the World Championship, NRG's defense was back to their top level form. They allowed the third fewest goals per game at the event and were on par with their insane defensive stats during RLCS X and earlier in the 21-22 season. On top of the goal numbers, they allowed the 6th fewest shots per game and the 6th lowest shooting percentage. Being 6th out of 24 teams in just one of these stats is pretty good, but getting the top 6 in both is pretty crazy. There were a lot of teams that were either good at keeping the number of shots low for their opponents or keeping the shooting percentage low, but there weren't a lot of teams that were great at both at the same time. In fact, only 3 teams managed to even be in the top 10 in both of these stats. One was of course NRG, who as I said before was top 6. Another team was version 1, home of the defensive god himself, Torment. And while they were good on defense, they were still below NRG in both of these categories. And the last team on this list is BDS, who was kind of a cheat code, but we'll get to them later. And in NRG's case, it's not even like they're racking up these good stats against the weaker teams they played, because their defense was just as good when they played against the top teams. In their matches against G2 and version 1, even though they lost both times, they never conceded more than 2 goals in a single game, which is something that no other main event teams that played against G2 or version 1 can say. Well, except for one, and I'm sure you can guess who it was. So, naturally, I looked deeper into the stats and film to try to figure out what exactly changed for NRG to do so much better on defense than they had recently, and what I found was both surprising and not surprising at all. If you haven't seen my Dr. Buttery video on NRG, I spent nearly all of the time talking about their defense, and Garrett was my main focus for a lot of it. I'm not going to rehash every point I made in that video again, but to summarize, I said that I wanted Garrett to be more aggressive on the defensive end. I didn't want Garrett on the backline making saves when the opponents had the ball. I wanted to see him in front of his teammates pressuring the ball as much as he could, so he could either take it away himself, or he could have one of his teammates come in and take the ball away after his ball pressure made the opponents uncomfortable. And the thing that was so surprising about their defensive Worlds is that is exactly what happened. In fact, not only was Garrett back to his old form in terms of applying midfield pressure, but it seemed like he was committing to it now more than he ever had before. At the very least, he was doing it more than he had at any point so far this season. When looking at his World Championship stats compared to his other events this season, Garrett posted new season highs in a bunch of categories that showed his renewed aggression. These include him having fewer saves than he's had all season, spending more time in the attacking third and as the farthest forward, while of course also spending less time in the defensive third and as the farthest back, and spending more time being positioned in front of the ball. And this aggression was definitely focused on defense, because despite the stats I just mentioned, he still only had 2.6 shots a game and 0.35 assists per game at Worlds. But that could also be an indication of the team's offensive struggles as a whole, which I'll get to in a bit. But to quickly look at Garrett's challenges in action, here we have Beast Mode starting an air dribble, and Garrett is all alone with no teammates near him. So he does what he does best and goes for the challenge, which sends the ball down to Justin and sets up a scoring chance, which they don't convert. Then a few seconds later, Squish is in a similar position, with Torment trying to dribble the ball out, and Squishy instead parks at midfield for the challenge, trying to make sure the ball doesn't get behind him. And when he makes contact, the ball goes out to Beast Mode, who goes for another air dribble. And once again, Garrett is there to challenge. And while he doesn't hit the ball this time, he does manage to bump Beast Mode away, which is just as good. The ball goes to Justin, and he hard clears it to V1 side, while NRG tries to set up their next offensive attack. So for their defense, I recommended that Garrett go back to his aggressive ways, and he did just that. And while there were more factors that went into their defensive improvement, his aggression played a big part in that. But now, let's move on to the offensive side of the ball, because there was one thing that I got very wrong last time. The reason why I spent so much time talking about their defense in the last video is because I figured their offense was going to be fine. They were pretty good on that side of the field throughout the season, with Spring Regional 3, the final regional of the season, being a huge exception to that. So while I briefly touched on what I thought went wrong in that tourney, I kinda dismissed it as just a one-off bad performance, and I thought that they'd be right back to normal on offense come Worlds. But if you watched Worlds and saw any of the games that NRG played, then you know that was not the case. Worlds was their second worst showing in regards to goals per game and shooting percentage, and it was their worst in terms of shots per game. NRG's offensive showing at Worlds was just as bad as the previous regional, so whatever the issues were, they weren't just going to go away. In order for their offense to go so poorly, multiple things had to go wrong, and that was definitely the case here. There's a severe lack of creativity in their offensive attacks, with a lot of them just having one player take the ball upfield by himself, followed by everybody on the team taking simple shots that were easily saved over and over again until their possession was over. If you imagine the old school G2 style of just taking shots over and over again until the defense finally breaks, but the team taking the shots is going too slow to put any actual pressure on the defense, then that's kind of what NRG looked like during Worlds. Playing like this at the top level just isn't viable, because unless the defense messes up, it's going to take a crazy solo play to get the ball in the goal. And while they, and especially Justin, have the ability to pull off these solo plays at times, it's not efficient enough to build a functional offense when you're trying to compete for a world championship. But if I were to focus on one point in particular about NRG's offense that was really lackluster, I would have to take a look at Squishy. And this is probably overdue anyways, because after my last video, I got a few complaints saying that I focused too much on Justin and Garrett, and I didn't talk enough about Squishy and what he could have done better too. Which is fair because I barely mentioned him in that video. One thing that really stood out to me about him at Worlds, both on the field and on the stat sheet, was how far away from the ball he always was. Garrett was back to his aggressive self on defense, and Justin had a new season high in closest average distance to the ball, having nearly the exact same distance as Garrett, so he was playing more aggressively than we'd seen in the past from him too. With both of his teammates playing this way, it's natural for Squishy to spend less time on the ball and be positioned more conservatively to give his teammates the room they need to be effective. And he did that. But in my opinion, Squishy took that conservative positioning way too far, and he was often so far away from the ball that he couldn't make a play on it when he needed to. Squishy's average ball distance was insanely high. It was higher than any other event this season, and that's saying something because this stat is usually really high for him anyways. And not only that, but the ball distance he had here was one of the largest that I'd ever seen. But to my surprise, it was only the second highest out of all the players in the event. Squishy looked like he wanted to be more defensive to compensate for his teammates, but he did it to such an extreme degree that instead of supporting their offensive pushes, Squishy was pretty much leaving them to fend for themselves. And because of that, NRG wasn't able to hang on to offensive pressure for long. Squishy gets the hard clear and NRG has a chance to create some offensive pressure, with the ball moving upfield and Garrett lining up his next hit. But instead of moving up with the offensive attack, Squishy flips towards his own back corner, staying all the way back on his side of the field. And Squishy has 73 boost after making the clear, so it's not like he had to go to the corner to get boost or anything, he just decided to stay back. And with Justin on the other side of the field refueling his boost, that means that Garrett is all by himself on the offensive attack. With no other realistic options, he goes for a very difficult low angle double tap. He doesn't connect and G2 is next to the ball. Then it seems like there's a small miscommunication between Justin and Squishy, as they both turn away from the ball, which gives the opponents extra space to work with. I'm willing to bet that Justin thought that Squishy would be closer and able to challenge, so he turned away to let him do so. But when he realized how far away Squishy actually was, he had to turn around again to challenge the ball from a weird angle with no momentum, and of course he gets beat. Squishy then has to make a really tough save while staring down Atomic and Chicago going for the bump, and he pulls it off. But this play is just one example of how the conservative positioning was hurting NRG's offense. They'd send the ball down to their side, and then the opponent would be able to send it right back with no issue. So as this team heads into the offseason, they decided to stick together for next season, as opposed to making a roster change. And just as I did at the end of my last video, I still believe that this is the right decision for this team. Their biggest weakness all season was their faltering defense, but at Worlds they proved that they can still be world class on that end. And while they've struggled on offense recently, all the other events this season have shown that they can still be really good on that end too. So now, instead of just being good at offense or defense, it's time for them to put all the pieces together and get back to the top tier team that we know and that they know they're capable of being. But if they come out in the fall split of next season and disappoint again, then it might be time to have a conversation. I think the coolest thing about Rocket League is how much it has in common with physical sports, because there are plenty of concepts in sports that apply to Rocket League as well. But there is one concept that is so fundamental to success in team sports that you see teams in nearly every single one trying to optimize for it. It's also the biggest reason for Karmine Corp's struggles earlier in the season, as well as the reason for their success later in the season. And of course, I'm talking about spacing. When you're able to get the ball to your best players and give them the room they need to operate, that's when they're able to have the biggest impact for their team. And the funniest part about this is that this is a pretty recent revelation in physical sports. Basketball used to be about really big and slow moving players dominating the paint next to the basket. But now, you'd much rather have a team of smaller and quicker shooters who can pull defenders away from the basket and from each other to give whoever has the ball more room to do whatever they want. American football used to feature clustered offenses with players packed really tightly together who would focus on winning the battle at the line of scrimmage to slowly work their way downfield. But now, we're starting to see more and more spread offenses, which stretches the field horizontally with smaller, quicker players. That way, when they get the ball to their playmakers, they'll have an easier time of beating a one-on-one tackle on the perimeter than they would trying to navigate through the big fellas in the middle of the field. And finally, soccer football has seen an increase in offensively minded wingbacks who are able to help progress their team's offensive push from the sides of the field instead of the team being forced to move the ball up through the center of the field so often. And playing from the sides like this gives players in the middle of the field just a bit more room to get open for shooting chances that are created by crosses from those wingbacks. So I say all of that to emphasize the fact that spacing is really, really important to success. If your spacing is bad, then your team is probably bad too. and there was no better example of that fact in the RLCS than K-Corp. When the 21-22 season started, Astral joined Itachi and Stake to form a team that many expected to sit at the top of Europe for the entire season, but that didn't pan out during the first two splits. In RLCS X, Astral was pretty much the hard carry for his team, meaning that he would fly around the field, fly through the air, and generally do as much as he could on the ball, looking to break down defenses single-handedly to either get a goal for himself or to make the job a little bit easier on his teammates when they would eventually get the ball. And at the same time, Itachi was becoming known for his great passing ability too, finishing first in the region in assists per game, showing off his ability to get the ball to teammates in nearly every scenario. These guys were great separately, but when they came together, they had a big problem. Because while they were both really good, in order for each of them to be at their best, they needed to have the ball to themselves. A lot. With both players being so ball dominant last season, this was going to have to change when they came together, because you can't have two players on the same team chase after the ball so often without there being some consequences. So the question was, who would take the step back? Would Astral let Itachi show off his passing more often? Or would Itachi back off and let Astral play the hard carry role that he did for his past team? Or maybe both players would take a small step back, finding a fair compromise where both players would have adequate space on the ball. Their answer to this question was none of these options. In fact, they basically went and did the opposite, because in the fall split of this season, both Itachi and Astral decreased their average distance to the ball. When each player started playing with another ball-dominant player, they both somehow managed to become more ball-dominant. And while Stake wasn't nearly as ball-chasey as his teammates, he was still in the top 20 for closest average distance to the ball, so he wasn't that far off. This caused a bunch of problems for their defense. With everyone being so close to the ball on offense, when K-Corp lost possession, they would be in a terrible spot to try to stop the counterattack, which gave their opponents some easy goals, and gave K-Corp one of the worst defenses in all of Europe, especially in regards to their allowed shooting percentage and the number of saves, since those two numbers show just how little defense they were actually playing. This play starts with Itachi blocking the opponent's clear to send the ball back into their offensive half. Stake jumps up for the redirect, which he gets after Rise misses the ball, and he hits it off the curve above the net, sending the ball straight down. Itachi jumps early to read the bounce off the ground, but with Joyo getting touched, there is no bounce, and Itachi's jump sends him straight out of the play. And finally, Astral comes up to go for a challenge in the corner, which he loses, and Buttery is right there to take the ball for himself. And with that, all three players have taken themselves out of the play, with a wide open net for Buttery to shoot the ball into. You don't see a 2v0 situation very often in Rocket League, but K-Corp just showed us how to create one. So the way that this playstyle affected their defense was pretty straightforward, but trying to figure out how the lack of spacing affected their offense was a little bit more complicated, because their offense was still pretty good, and it was the main reason why this team was even competitive in the first place. But for a team that had Astral, Itachi, and Stake, it didn't feel like it was quite as good as it should have been. The stats show that they were really efficient with the shots that they took, but they weren't able to take many shots to utilize that efficiency, which isn't a problem that you see many teams that shoot that well have. When K-Corp was on offense and packed together like this, the degree of difficulty for their offensive pushes was very high. If they were able to pass the ball back and forth to each other while being so close together, while keeping it away from the defense, then they would probably get a really good shot that would be really hard to save. And this shows up in their efficiency. But on the other hand, when you're so close to each other like this, there are so many things that can go wrong to stop the offensive push. Being this close decreases the margin of error you have for your passes, and if you miss, the possession's over. Plus, as a defender, you typically have to choose what you're going to defend. Most of the time, one player won't be able to defend the pass and the shot, so you have to pick one to shut off and force the opponent to go for the other option. But when the offense is this tight together, there are more scenarios when one defender is able to cover multiple options, because all of the options will be developing in the same part of the field. So if the defender is able to get into the right spot and cover all their options, then they can shut down the possession single-handedly. And when you're playing against the best teams who have great defenders, they usually are able to find that spot. Honestly, with all of these factors to account for, I was very impressed that their offense was able to do as well as they did to this point in the season. So heading into the spring split, K-Corp faced a tough problem. Their current performance wasn't good enough, and something had to change. But despite having playstyles that would clash with each other pretty often, it was still clear that Astral and Itachi were the two best players on the team, and getting rid of either one would lower the team's skill ceiling. So in making the roster change, they had to find somebody that would fit around these two players, and all the problems that came with them. So if you're going to find someone that play alongside two ball chasers, you need to find someone that doesn't need the ball all the time to be effective, who could serve as a safety valve for the defense, while also giving the team the spacing they need to operate on offense. And there isn't a single player who could fill this role in Europe better than Nali. He's really good whenever he has the ball, but he's also really patient and really good at picking the right time to go in and get the ball, while he waits far away from the play for that moment to come. He also likes to take really wide rotations around the play when he's going from offense to defense, instead of going for the more disruption-focused near-post rotations that we see from Astral and Itachi more often. And these wide rotations would give his teammates a clear path to challenge the ball when it was their turn to do so. So having Nali alongside Astral and Itachi would give those two players much more breathing room, even if they weren't giving that same breathing room to each other. And when the spring split started, this roster move immediately paid off for them. with K-Corp consistently placing well in the spring events, instead of trading good finishes with poor finishes like they had been before. This consistency led them to finishing 4th in Europe during the spring split after the online regionals, and it gave them their first major qualification of the season. And the most fun part about watching this roster is that nobody really played any different from how they did before, but the pieces just fit together so much better. Astral and Itachi were still hanging around the ball as much as possible, and Nolly was still sitting far away from the play doing what he does. But now, if the ball went somewhere unexpected because of a lost 50, Nolly would be there to either follow up on the play himself or to get back to the goal to stop the counterattack. K-Corp saw a drastic stat increase on both offense and defense, with their offense being able to get shots on target more often, while more or less maintaining their really good efficiency. And on defense, they managed to make more saves as a team, while cutting down on their opponent's shooting percentage. And the best part may be that Nolly's spacing opened up much more viable passing lanes for all 3 players to take advantage of. Because while Astral and Itachi are 2 of the best passers in the region, Nolly's proven that he can be right there with them. After Nolly's 50, and Illusion's hit right after, the ball goes out to the left side of the field, with Astral and Itachi following it to that side, while Nolly turns around to stay on the right side of the field. Itachi gets a couple touches on the ball trying to find a way past the defense, and once it goes behind him, Astral immediately comes in for his own challenge. And by the time Astral makes his touch, we have him on the ball, Itachi just starting his rotation out, so he's still really close, and we have all 3 Optic players in the corner ready to defend. And then we have Nolly, who is all the way over here. Astral's hit bounces off Illusion, and it goes right into the middle of the field, where Nolly is now the only player close enough to follow up on it. And he has so much time that he's able to turn away from the ball and come back to it to get a better angle on his touch. And there's still nobody close to him when he gets to the ball. With all 3 Optic players surrounding the net, a shot from here is probably getting saved. So instead, he side flips into the ball, sending a perfect infield pass to Itachi. Dries isn't able to intercept the pass, and Illusion is way too late when he tries to challenge Itachi. So he takes the shot, and he sends it right under the crossbar, where Mist can't reach it. With their newfound on-field chemistry and team balance, I was really excited about this team heading into the next season, and I thought that they were well positioned to be one of the best teams in not just Europe, but the entire world. But unfortunately, I have to use past tense now, because this roster is no longer together, with only Itachi remaining on K-Corp. While I'm kind of disappointed in the decision because I really wanted to see how much farther this team could go together, with the roster that they're rumored to be picking up next season, I can't really blame them at all, because they're looking kind of scary. And I'm looking forward to talking more about this team if and when the move becomes official. Spacestation's been one of my most requested teams for a while now, like pretty much since the end of the Winter Major. And while I do have that spotlight on Daniel where I compared him to Aqua, it has been a while since I looked at this team as a whole. It's unfortunate that by the time I do, the team is already split up, but, you know, what are you gonna do, right? But there was always one thing that I didn't like when people asked me to make a video on them. They would always ask me to talk about why Spacestation was doing so poorly, or what was going wrong with Spacestation that made them so disappointing. I got a lot of these questions after the Winter and Spring Major, and honestly I had to wonder if we were watching the same team. I can kinda understand being a little let down during the regionals, since they were the 5th seed in the winter and the 4th seed in the spring heading into those majors. But at the actual majors, SSG was clearly one of the best teams there in both LA and London. They finished 3rd and in the top 6 at those 2 majors respectively, with their only losses coming to the teams that made it to the grand finals. So I didn't think that the disappointment that I had been seeing from some of their fans was warranted given the team's quality of play. But if there was a performance that SSG fans had a reason to be disappointed in, then it would have been the World Championship. But even with their struggles there, while some of it was stuff that they could control, a lot of it was because of stuff they couldn't. And the biggest example is with Arsenal. It's well known that he was incredibly sick during the wildcard stage, to the point where he was throwing up, and he even checked into a hospital after the wildcard was over. Considering his situation, he still played really well, but it was obvious that his sickness was having a huge impact on his playing ability, especially when it came to his scoring touch. He was 43rd out of 49 players in both goals per game and goal participation during the wildcard stage, and he was 45th in shooting percentage, with both of these stats being well below the standard that he had set for himself earlier in the season. Luckily for Arsenal, and for SSG, Reynolds and Daniel were more than able to pick up the extra slack, and their performance in the wildcard stage was good enough to help them get through to the main event, while probably having the most difficult path to get there in terms of the teams that they played against. Both players increased their scoring output and efficiency during the wildcard, and became a 1-2 punch that was very hard for their opponents to handle. But to Arsenal's credit, if there was one thing that he still did very well in the wildcard stage, it was using his typical aggressive style to set up scoring plays for his teammates, as he actually had slightly more assists in the wildcard stage than he had in the rest of the season. Reynolds is taking possession of the ball in the corner, and he has Arsenal out in front of him. Pretty much everyone who knows anything about this team is expecting Arsenal to drive ahead and get a bump on the goalie to clear the way for Reynolds, which means that Scrub, the player in goal, is also expecting it too. To avoid that bump, Scrub drives in to line up an early challenge, hoping to get to the ball before Arsenal gets to him. But after boosting in front of the ball, which makes the demo attempt look even more convincing from Scrub's POV, Arsenal then slows down and turns into the ball, directing it into the back wall and away from Scrub as he dives in for the challenge. And now Scrub is completely out of the picture. And with no more defenders in the way, Redos has an easy tap-in goal. So with the wildcard done, and Arsenal more or less over his sickness, SSG was ready to come into the group stage without any external factors or distractions getting in the way of their success. But then, it was around this time when Redos heard that he was going to be kicked from the team after the tournament was over. And honestly, I can't think of many things that are more demotivating than playing for a team that's already confirmed that they don't want you anymore, making you a dead man walking in terms of your place on the team. So because of this, Redos now became the player that was dealing with external factors. And Redos and Arsenal basically swapped their stats with one another between the wildcard and the group stage, with Redos now being the low-scoring inefficient shooter, and Arsenal reaching new heights with his scoring. This might have been enough to get them through the wildcard stage, but with the increase in skill level of their opponents from the wildcard to the group stage, and Daniel's numbers coming down a little bit after the highs he experienced during the wildcard, SSG bowed out of the tournament after losses to Moise and V1, only making it to the top 12. One thing that I thought was honestly kind of funny about how this team played during the group stage was just how many demos Redos was getting. I'm sure you already know that Redos gets a lot of demos per game, being near the top of the region in that stat. But in the group stage, he became even more bloodthirsty than he's been all season, easily surpassing his average for that stat. It was almost as if he decided to take his anger out on his opponents by blowing them up as often as possible after he heard the news. And honestly, given all the other ways he could have responded to the news, that's a pretty good alternative. The only problem is that when you go for demos this often, there are likely to be more times where you overcommit for one, and if you don't get the demo, then it'll be harder for your team to play defense. After his 50 bounces up to the ceiling, Redos turns and looks for the bump on Vatira. He barely misses him, and since the corner boost is already gone, that means he has to rotate back on 0 boost. Meanwhile, Daniel gets his touch blocked by Vatira, and the ball is sent back to Spacestation's side. And Arsenal gets bumped by Joyo while he's heading back to the net, which slows him down too. So now the ball is going to SSG's side, with 2 Moist players nearby and no SSG players in a good spot to defend. Vatira loops around the ball to find the angle, and he takes the shot. And while Arsenal did manage to get back to the goal, he's still in a very tough spot, and he can't make the save. Now I'm not trying to say that this play is all Redos' fault or anything, and I like the decision to go for a bump, because if he connects, then it's an easy goal. Also, Daniel could have made a better play on the ball, and Joyo did well to bump Arsenal during his rotation. But I really just wanted to show you an example of what it looks like when going for a bump downfield goes wrong, which had happened a couple times for SSG. But now as they head into the offseason, Spacestation seems primed to replace Redos with LJ. And while I'm again going to wait until this move is made official before I give my full thoughts, I'll say for now that as much as I hate how the transfer was handled by the team, I can't fault the decision at all. LJ has been a star for Oxygen Esports ever since that roster came together under the name Jamal Jabari, and I'm betting that we'll see his passing ability and his ball skills absolutely flourish under the new look Spacestation. They of course won't be as demo heavy as we've seen in the past, and as sad as I am about that, I don't think that'll matter too much in the long run. Plus, Redos seems to have found a pretty good landing spot on his new potential team alongside AJ, which I'm just as excited about. So there's no need to be upset for Redos because he'll be just fine. I've talked about a team from every region this past season except for Sub-Saharan Africa, so let's finish off our world tour and talk about the Orlando Pirates. All 3 of their players were in the top 10 in shooting percentage during the World Championship, while no other team even had 2 players in the top 10. And as a team, they had the best shooting percentage in the whole event by a pretty wide margin. While their shooting percentage was propped up pretty significantly by their series against the Gladiators, even if you remove the stats from that series, their shooting percentage still would have been high enough to be the best of the event. Now I should say that their offense wasn't really all that good, because aside from the series against Gladiators, their goal production was pretty pedestrian. But the main point that I'm making is that even though this team came into the event with no expectations whatsoever, they actually looked pretty decent. And while it's going to take time for this team and their region to become real threats on the world stage, this event went about as well as they could have hoped for. Snowy especially looked like he was up to the challenge, as he finished in the top 10 in the whole event for goals and saves, and was generally the focal point of his team's offensive attack. And with his average speed also being in the top 10 in the entire event, he was able to take his opponents by surprise and get to the ball faster than they would expect him to. With his teammates being slower to the ball and around the field, their opponents would expect to have more time to take their touches. But when Snowy was up to challenge, that expectation would work against them and allow Snowy to come in and take the ball before they were ready. Math beats Darth to the ball, sending it to the sidewall where he can follow up on it after grabbing boost. But while he lines up his hit, Snowy grabs the corner boost, turns, and immediately takes flight from the ground to meet Math in the air for the 50, which sends the ball to the other side of the field. Snowy then boosts down to speed up his recovery for the following hit, while Sad is taking his time to line up the touch after grabbing his back corner boost. This hesitation gives Snowy all the time he needs to catch up to the ball and beat Sad to the touch, all while collecting each boost pad along the way. Then he gets the perfect bounce off the corner on the ceiling, which puts the ball right back down in front of him in a perfect shooting position. Knight isn't able to challenge the ball from where he is, so he tries to turn back to the goal to make the save on the shot as it comes in, but he's too slow to adjust, and Snowy sends the ball into the right side of the net. And as far as my off-season thoughts for this team, after the World Championship they dropped their player skill steal, opening a spot on the roster. And while the Orlando Pirates had the best team in their region, it could be argued that they didn't have the best player, because To Die For from Bravado Gaming won the region's MVP award. And I'm sure you can guess where I'm going with this. It's time to put together the South African super team. I'm going to try to keep this section short, because one, this video is getting already way longer than I thought it was going to be, but also because I'll talk about this team after the Winter Major, and a lot of what I said then still applies now. When G2 brought in Atomic after the fall split, they replaced their super fast, constantly shooting offensive attack with a style that was still pretty fast, but they also showed more of a willingness to slow the game down and be more methodical with their attacks, instead of just always trying to brute force their way through their opponents. This resulted in G2 having fewer shots in the winter and spring splits than they did in the fall split, but a higher shooting percentage to make up for it. And seeing how this roster change has benefited Atomic individually has been great to see, because honestly he's never looked better. I've thought that Atomic is the best passer in North America for pretty much the past 2 years now, but during the fall he wasn't quite getting the stats that you would expect the best passer to have, since he was 8th in assists per game during that split at 0.54. Now that's still really good, but I would expect him to be a bit higher. But in the time since he's joined G2, his average has increased to 0.63, giving him the 3rd most assists per game for the entire RLCS season, behind only First Killer and Typical. Playing alongside an aggressive player like Chicago, and alongside JNaps, who's the team's 3rd man in terms of positioning, but is still a great shooter himself, Atomic was on the perfect team for a great passer like himself. And G2 as a whole have been reaping the benefits of it ever since the beginning of the winter split. But during the World Championship, Chicago probably shined the brightest for this team. He was taking shot after setups from both Atomic and JNaps, and he also teamed up with Atomic to put the pressure on opposing defenses with their aggressive positioning and boost stealing. And for as good of a passer Atomic is, JNaps was the one to lead G2 in assists per game during Worlds. So while he's the least aggressive player on the team, and the proverbial 3rd man, he's still really good on the ball himself, and he's one of the most well-rounded players that this game has ever seen. And all of this would be good enough on its own, but then G2 managed to have the best defensive Worlds too, in terms of goals per game and allowed shooting percentage. And an allowed shooting percentage this low is something we used to never see out of G2. Before they got Atomic, their best defensive strategy was to stay on offense for as long as they could and keep the opponent from taking shots at all. But if the opponents managed to get past that, then they would have a good chance of scoring. But now, they don't have to worry about that, because even if shots do come in, they have no problem keeping them out. G2 is a well-oiled machine on offense and defense, and are solidly at the top of NA because of it. But to focus on Atomic's passing again, let's look at their series against Furia. JNaps makes the save and passes the ball out to the corner where Chicago is waiting for the clear. And after going all the way downfield to steal boost while G2 is on defense, Atomic is able to come back in time to follow up on Chicago's hit before Yang gets to it and keeps the ball moving downfield. So now as the ball goes into the corner and then the back wall, Atomic's waiting for the perfect chance to pass it down to Chicago. He sits patiently while Kyle's flying up for the challenge, but right before he gets there, Atomic gets under the ball and just barely turns up into it, which lifts the ball above Kyle and sends it straight to Chicago, who's already in the air, and he finishes the play off with a goal. I don't know who took away all of Seiko's talent before the Spring Major, but I'm glad they gave it back in time for Worlds. I was worried that his bad performance in London would shake his confidence moving forward, but he deserves a lot of credit for rounding back into his regular world-class form in time for the season's finale. So instead of a bad omen of things to come, his Spring Major performance will now just be known as one unexpected and honestly pretty confusing outlier in what was otherwise a legendary rookie season. His performance was even good enough for him to be awarded MVP of the World Championship, and while I personally would have gone with Monkey Moon, I can't really be mad at their choice, because they were both pretty deserving. It's hard to even point out one area specifically where Seiko improved from the Spring Major during the World Championship, because frankly nearly all of the mistakes that he was making in the Spring Major were cleaned up in the World Championship. But if I was to focus on one thing, I'd say that Seiko's decision making and execution on his first touches was a lot better. My biggest complaint about him during the Spring Major was that he kept making bad decisions and bad missed touches whenever he got a chance to possess the ball in space. This was a far cry from the regular season, where if he had space on his first touch, he would always use it to perfectly set up his second touch, whether that was coming in the form of an air dribble or a double tap or whatever he wanted to do. In Worlds, he was back to his regular form of getting good first touches, but in that return to form, he also looked much more patient and methodical than he had at any point so far this season. He beat his previous season highs in slowest average speed and least amount of time spent in the offensive third, and this patience was a big part of his return to form. He also spent more time making plays on the ball up in the air than he had before, which probably contributed to a slower average speed, since you're generally going slower in the air than you do on the ground. But to focus on BDS as a whole for a second, one of the biggest talking points after the World Championship was how boring the Grand Final was, which I can understand, because in a game as big as the Grand Finals when you're hoping to see a back and forth shootout, domination can be pretty boring, especially when that dominance is focused on the defensive side of the ball. If it isn't going to be a super close, intense matchup, then the next thing that people would ask for are a bunch of highlight plays. But those are going to be hard to come by when the two teams that meet in the grand finals are the two that allow the fewest goals per game out of anybody else in the entire tournament. And this was apparent in the matchup by both teams failing to reach their average number of goals per game when they faced off against each other in the grand finals, with G2 being much farther from their average than BDS was. I always used to talk about how important Mark Bayet was to BDS's defensive success, and while I figured that their defensive style would look different after the roster change, one thing that I didn't anticipate was their defense arguably being even better than it was before. I would still argue that their defense was slightly better with Mark Bayet instead of Seiko, but there's no denying that Worlds was one of their best defensive showings for the entire season. If their defense with Mark was reliant on following up on the pressure that he created from his aggressive early challenges, then the new look BDS is more focused on waiting for the right time to challenge, and doing it on their own terms instead of rushing in at the first chance that they get. And the critical point where they made this decision to challenge or not was often at the midfield line. If the opponents were taking the ball out of their half and there's no clear chance to take the ball away earlier, then whoever is in position to do so would usually wait until the ball got closer to the midfield line before they challenged, as long as there's a teammate behind them in support. This play right here is probably the clearest example of it. Monkey Moon could have challenged Chicago earlier to force a play out of him, but since Chicago has pretty good control of the ball and there's no clear chance to take it away from him, he instead turns around and gets into a sort of shadow position while he's on the wall. Then, when the ball gets closer to midfield after Chicago's attempted clear, he jumps off and gets his hit on the ball. Then we have Extra on the midfield line, looking for a chance to go for the ball himself. But after Monkey's touch, Extra's angle to the ball is pretty awkward, slowing down his follow-up. But he is so committed to challenging at midfield anyways, that he does a whole 3-point turn in the middle of the play, trying to see if he can create a better opportunity to go for the ball. Of course he gets beat and he has to rotate out of there, but the fact that he was this committed to challenging in this area of the field says a lot about how this team wants to play defense. And while all of this was going on, Seiko was taking a wide rotation back to their half, so they always had him in support just in case. But if there was no player in support, and the player in midfield was the last man back, then what you'd usually see is that player then go into shadow defense to buy the time needed for his teammates to get back there. And then once the teammates were done rotating, they'd go for the challenge. This is something that we've always seen from Extra as the last man back, but after the roster change, we're starting to see it more and more from the whole roster, which is actually causing some double commits to happen too, which is something we would basically never see from the old roster. Now they don't happen very often, and in the rare circumstances when they do, the other player on the team is usually back to support anyways, so these double commits were basically never catastrophic. But this is one chink in the armor that they didn't have before, so it might be something to keep an eye on moving forward. But it also might not, because, I mean, come on, they're still BDS. I just broke my record for my longest YouTube video yet, so if you're still here watching this, then I appreciate you, for real. Follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all at the next one. And of course, thanks for watching.